that we are here to do the book launch for Stuart Airlie, and the book I have a copy of, one of the very few people who do, Making and Unmaking the Carolingians, 751 to 888. Now, it's not the weirdest thing that's happened in the pandemic that we're having a book launch for a book that's been out for more than a year. But that it is still relatively new, and that also it means that we are ideally placed to launch the paperback edition, which is coming out in July, and there is an offer from the university bookshop. What I will try and do during the course for those online, during the course of proceedings, I'll try and share screen and put up the details of the offer for you too, so that everybody can benefit. But this gets you the Making and Unmaking of the Carolingians for £26, and you know, a bargain for holiday reading. So the format which we usually do for these things is the presentazione, whereby we get an eminent scholar to sort of introduce the book. Now, I remember telling a colleague about this from another university, and you know, getting eye-rolling and pretentious, Glasgow, but actually I will stand by this format. I think that it is it gives you a little bit of hard intellectual edge. It avoids the vacuous puffery of the book launch party, but you do get, without the sort of hobnailed boots of the sort of seminar. So the eminent scholar that we've got, and a man who would be completely incapable of vacuous puffery anyway, is Professor Simon MacLean of the University of St Andrews. Simon, a string of publications, most recently the book on Ottonian queenship. But there's also, if you're not an early medievalist, and I'm not, or at least I wasn't until quite recently, there are just really useful stuff that he's done, that he's translated the Chronicle of Regino of Prune. He's done a very good, edited a very good second edition of Angus Mackay's Atlas of Medieval History. There is just then the sort of person you want to sort of take on this, to cast an expert eye, but also to be able to put it in perspective. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Professor MacLean, and we will take it from there. Thank you.
So let the vacuous puffery commence. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to come and speak at this event. Forgive any nerves, half the people in this room used to mark my presentations to class in the 1990s, so there's a Proustian flashback for me now. I've got about 20 minutes worth of stuff to say about this book. I'm not sure if I can beat the online reviewer who simply said, this is a mic drop of a history book, in a review that has apparently been deleted from Amazon for reasons unknown. But anyway, for me, it was a real pleasure and a privilege to be asked to contribute to the launch of this important book. Let me start by saying I genuinely cannot remember the last time I enjoyed reading a history book as much as this one, and I've read it twice. It is a brilliant analysis of how royal power worked and didn't work in the Carolingian world of the 8th and 9th centuries. It's already been rapturously received by specialists in the period, and I think it should also have a further impact as a model for how one can write the history of other pre-modern dynasties. And as far as teaching goes, I'm planning to get students to read it alongside Ginty Nelson's biography of Charlemagne and Micah de Jong's The Penitential State as a kind of masterclass in ways of writing early medieval political history in the 21st century. So I know that not everyone will have read it yet. For those who haven't, who were the Carolingians? The Carolingians were a royal family who dominated Western Europe for the best part of 150 years in the early Middle Ages, with one branch enjoying a less impressive coda running down to nearly the end of the 10th century, which doesn't count for present purposes because, as Stuart shows, is one of his arguments, this 10th century branch is really a part of what we can legitimately refer to as a post-Carolingian era. Hence, the books focus on the period of 751 to 888. The empire itself covers about 1 million square kilometers from Saxony and Brittany in the north in the north and west, to Catalonia, Tuscany, and the edges of the Czech Republic and Hungary in the south and east. So the basic story is as follows. The Carolingians were an aristocratic family from the northeast of the Kingdom of the Franks being the kingdom established in Gaul at the end of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. The kingdom was ruled for about 250 years by a family called the Merovingians, and the Carolingians began to dominate the royal court beginning in the late 7th century, eventually mounting a coup in 751, by which the first Carolingian king, confusingly referred to as Pippin III, took over. And Pippin III and his son Charles, aka Charlemagne, conquered numerous neighboring polities in the second half of the 8th century, absorbing Bavaria, Aquitaine, Saxony, northern Italy, Catalonia, etc., into their empire. With the end of the expansion of the empire around the year 800, the Carolingians turned to government, and the surviving documentation significantly increases. We have a lot of legal texts, we have a lot of charters, documents dealing with basically land transfers and privileges, transfer of privileges, as well as quite a lot of contemporary history and ancient history written out and copied by Carolingian scribes. So this is the sort of high point of the whole operation around the year 800. In the traditional version of the story, that's when things also started to go wrong, certainly after the death of Charlemagne in 814. His son, Louis the Pious, was deposed twice by his own sons in the 830s, an obvious sign of weakness. And those same sons then spent the next few decades fighting each other over territory, which was now, following the Treaty of Verdun in 843, starting to look a bit like the proto-map of modern Europe. So with a kingdom that looks a bit like France and a kingdom that looks a bit like Germany. And as these this is still the traditional story, as these narrower solidarities hardened, the kings got ever more short-lived and accident-prone. One died in a hunting accident aged 18, another aged 16 from injuries sustained while chasing a girl into a house while on a horse. So that by 885, there was only one male line king left, Charles the Fat, an ill man who was deposed in 887 and died soon after without a recognized heir. Thus ended not the Carolingian line per se, but as Stuart emphasizes, and this is really his most fundamental point, the Carolingian monopoly on royal power in the Frankish realms. So the landscape changed as a consequence of that shift. So if you're interested in power and politics, the history of the Carolingians really has everything you want. It's got good kings, bad kings, sinister advisors, treachery, Vikings, powerful queens, wrong princes, palace coups, etc., etc. The American historian Geoffrey Koziol remarked, if Shakespeare had been French, he would have written Charles the Simple. Somehow, though, Hollywood and the modern stage have remained immune to the charms of 9th century history, except for the 1972 musical Pippin by Stephen Schwartz and Bob Fosse, which won a few Tonys. I haven't seen it. Carolingian political history and its vast corpus of scholarship, going back to Ranke in the 19th century, can be quite a tough sell to the uninitiated. Partly that's because it's complicated and doesn't have a lot of name recognition. There are quite a lot of people called Louis and Charles involved. It's quite hard to make it interesting when you're constantly having to remind people which Louis is which Charles is which. I once wrote an article which had 3 different Louis IIIs in it, all doing stuff at the same time. I got into a lot of trouble trying to placate the editor of the journal to convince her that I had actually done this in a way that was comprehensible. So perhaps, as well as that, perhaps it's also fair to say that some of the classic debates we've inherited, even in the 21st century, are at least ancestrally institutional or even constitutional. The meaning of the imperial title acquired by Charlemagne in the year 800, for example, the nature of the state in the 9th century, the significance of the Carolingian period for the formation of Europe is another one, and so on and so forth. Another pervasive influence on the way that we write history of this period is the narrative structure of rise and fall, which fundamentally shapes the way that people like to write about empires in general. And this was so pervasive that until quite recently, the way to do a PhD in this topic was simply to find a Carolingian king from the late 9th century who hadn't been done yet and try to rescue their reputation from historiographical neglect. Now, I think it's fair to say that this, I'm sort of exaggerating, I guess, for effect, but it's fair to say that these ways of, these categories of writing history of this period within began to change, especially thanks to a wave of writing in English, in a wave which really took off in the 1980s. And Stuart was on the ground floor of that with a long series of brilliant and justly influential essays, some collected in an earlier book, Power and Its Problems. To mention just a few, which I think have been particularly important, his article on the life of Gerald of Aurillac as a source for the mores of the Frankish aristocracy from 1992, which is still the fundamental text on that important source. Private Bodies and the Body Politic from Past and Present in 1998, to my mind, the one article of the many on the bewildering divorce case of Lothar II that you would take to the desert island if you absolutely had to choose. Papers on the Royal Frankish Annals, Narratives of Triumph, one on Regino of Prum's Chronicle, Sad Stories of the Death of Kings, which are absolutely the best papers you can read in any language on those texts which bookended the Carolingian era. And two articles on the nature of the royal palace in the early medieval period, the Palace of Memory and the Palace Complex, which one can go back to with profit again and again to find new insights on the nature of political centers in the early Middle Ages. If you've read all that stuff, you'll be able to see how it feeds into Making and Unmaking the Carolingians. But the book turns our attention more firmly to one of the Carolingian world's most conspicuous institutions, the dynasty itself. But rather than inviting us to admire the institutionness of the dynasty, Stuart unpacks it, he deconstructs it like an anthropologist. I don't think anyone else could have written this book. Stuart's early research on the aristocracy gives him a kind of outsider perspective on the Carolingians, at least from one social level down, which doesn't sound like a lot, but most of the time when you try to engage in political history of this period, what you're trying to do is work out what the kings were doing and thinking and why, because that's the way the sources are that come down to us lead you. So to try to get to this from the perspective of the recipients of kingship and rulership is a really difficult thing to do. I want to stress, though, that this is not just a book about the dynasty that might supplement other ways of thinking about the empire via its institutions or its government, for example. It's actually a new way of looking at those topics and sources as well. Assemblies, legal texts, and oaths are all put to use in the service of the argument in this book. So this is not a book that's just about the Carolingian dynasty. It's a book that puts the Carolingian dynasty at the center of the history of the Carolingian Empire and gives you a platform to look at things from a completely different perspective. So dynasty is important because it's one of those things that's so obvious and so obviously important that it's usually taken for granted. It's just a basic fact of medieval power. Even worse, the complexity of this category is often obscured by the conventions of historical narrative. We simply say, Charlemagne did this, Charles the Fat did that, as a kind of shorthand or paraphrase of the sources. Tim Reuter pointed out this habit, writing here with reference to the 10th century Ottonian kings, Rulership is a black box. There are visible inputs and outputs, but the internal functioning by which the first are converted into the second is all too often not available for our scrutiny and analysis. Otto I, or Henry VIII, or Adolf Hitler, for us, is not so much a clearly defined individual as a kind of historian's code for himself and his entourage. So what I think Stuart's done in this book is to crack open that black box to show us the individuals inside and unveil how and why this political system worked. And he does this not by piecing together a theory of what government was, which is a kind of a very familiar enterprise to historians of this period, which would involve classic questions like who were the king's advisors, how was advice taken, how did the decisions of royal assemblies transmit out into the provinces from the palace. Stuart does this by instead unveils the complex relationships, pressures, and uncertainties that operated on powerful individuals at any given moment. So the making and unmaking of the book's title is not, I think, a reference to the creation of the empire and in the late 8th century and its demise in the late 9th. Instead, it describes the work that went into creating, maintaining, and naturalizing the idea of the Carolingians as a special royal family. And this is work that was constant and iterative over the whole period. So it's an escape from the rise and fall idea. It's a completely new paradigm for understanding this history. It's really about a permanently evolving model of authority, not describing a structure that was first built by skilled architects and then later collapsed due to poor maintenance. So this is a book about the internalization of the idea of Carolingian authority by the powerful, the not so powerful, and by the Carolingians themselves. The opening of the book invites us to ponder the question, why do people obey authority? And this is a huge question, which is rarely posed. Where's the camera? Isn't that good for them?
So they are wanted. Can we get the screens working?
Am I just standing in the wrong place? Is that what it is? I'm just standing in the wrong place.
Yeah. Look at this.
Okay.
Hi, Mitch.
How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Great to see you.
Yeah, and you. You're looking very distinguished with your beard.
Oh, well, I'm going to get my hair cut like Henry V behind you there. He looks fantastic.
Yeah. It's the original Peaky Blinders.
I think we're in business.
Right, so I just stand here, yeah?
God, there's so many of us. Great.
All right.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, hello, everybody. Okay, shall I crack on? Yeah, all right, cool. Okay, so why do people obey authority? A huge question, rarely posed. So you can see this, I think, working most explicitly in the thematic chapters of the book. That's 1, 4, 7, and 8, as I'm sure those of you who've read it will remember, which gather material from right across the period, 7th to 10th century, with extra bits from both ends. And here, in these chapters, Stuart painstakingly dissects the parts played by royal children, by women, and by others in the construction of family charisma, in the management of resources, the cultivation of prayers for the family, the allocation of control over churches, the sponsoring of genealogies, histories and liturgies, which not only praised Carolingian authority, but encouraged audiences to take it for granted. This is the key point. He shows the significance of tombs to this process. I mean, if you go to Saint Denis, even now, it's hard not to be impressed by, push your way past all the Capetian stuff, down to the crypt, and you can find a list of all the Frankish kings from Dagobert I down to the 10th century who were buried in that crypt. And just the list itself, with the repetition of the names, is quite a powerful thing. And that's what that goes to one of Stuart's points, which is that names and naming were crucial to this process of inculcation. It was not by accident that family names like Charles and Louis became linked with the concept of royalty itself. repetition was intentional, names, as Stuart puts it, evoked and telescoped history. So not only the aristocracy, but the family itself was the audience for this effort, which was about teaching ways of thinking. And one of the important things to note in this book is the way that Stuart defines the Carolingian family very broadly. It's not the usual stuff that that you read about medieval dynasties of fathers and sons negotiating the succession. He brings in all kinds of people and shows how they were drawn into the project. And it's interesting that the only person called something a bit like a Carolingian in the 9th century itself was a bishop of Liège, not a ruler. So the co-opting of different audiences for Carolingian teaching about Carolingianness is one of the book's most important arguments. We can see here what was thinkable and unthinkable in terms of who should rule, who should be allowed to be a ruler. So this is a kind of Gramscian internalization, which incidentally also shows that the world of our texts is the world of power. We shouldn't mistake our texts for simply intellectual commentaries with pious monastic agendas. So this is an educational or ideological effort, but it's not achieved through didactic methods in the literal sense. It was generated through constant reiteration in a whole range of media, the orchestration of events, and the management of relationships between powerful individuals. Stuart refers to this in total as the sweet music of Carolingian togetherness, one of numerous musical metaphors in the book. Rodgers and Hammerstein and Wagner are among his reference points, alongside the more expected references to Bourdieu, Foucault, and Hergé's Adventures of Tintin. Music is a very apt way of conveying the kind of insistent habits of thought which are at the heart of this book's thesis. You might not be happy with your local Carolingian king, but as the anthropologists say, you cannot argue with a song. So these are the thematic chapters that deal with this, with these various sort of categories of training for people in the 8th and 9th century to look at power in a particular way. But for me, the much harder trick to pull off is to apply these insights to the narrative of unfolding events and to use them in context to explain how all these things might actually work in a chronological sense and in practice. And I think it's easy to miss how difficult it is to do this successfully. And he does in the book. Stuart's perspective enables him to make some striking reframings of various key moments in the period. So for example, the expansion of the empire in the 8th century is shown to be not simply a military question, but one driven by the dynamics of the Carolingian family itself. Pippin III seized the throne in 751, not because the Merovingians were terminally useless, which is what the Carolingians, how they told the story themselves, but because Pippin felt threatened by his own relatives. Likewise, Charlemagne's conquest of Bavaria, which was ruled at the time by his cousin Tassilo, who he saw as a threat. And this is a really key insight. What he's arguing is that actors act sometimes because they effectively have no choice or feel that they have no choice. Another example from the book is Boso of Vienne, the non-Carolingian aristocrat who leapt for a throne in the year 879 when, as Stuart shows, Boso felt he had to either go up or fall. He had to climb or fall. So the really significant argument here is that these people's actions are shaped not just by circumstances, but by the logic of the Carolingian dynastic system, by what was to them thinkable. We also have here new light on even well-trodden areas like the reigns of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious. So, for example, the last 25 years of Charlemagne's reign is shown convincingly to be an anxious dance around the succession, with parties forming and dissolving, and a fascinating analysis of how what the king did shaped the decisions of others and vice versa, against maybe the more traditional approach to this period, which would emphasize the expansion of the number of sources and what this says about the formation of a state and the creation of top-down structures of command. Where are we? Oh yeah, chapter 5. Chapter 5, I think, is the key chapter in the whole book. It cannot, it can't be easy to find something new to say about the reign of Louis the Pious, because Louis the Pious has been the subject of a huge rehabilitative literature since 1990. This is Charlemagne's son, who was deposed twice by his own sons. And Louis has, to some extent, been put back into the story as someone who was not weak, but someone who sort of did his best. Now, Stuart, rightly, I think, re-injects some tension and anxiety back into this reign, not by reheating traditional allegations of Louis's weakness, but by uncovering the instability of the dynastic situation. Even though Louis was, on Stuart's reading, highly aware of the Carolingian dynastic system as it was operating by this point, Louis's attempts to shape events were driven by factors far out with his own control. And his innovative attempts to control things, for example, by formalizing a hierarchy among his sons or proclaiming his own will to be paramount, were not weakness. They were not signs of weakness, they were signs of aggression, but they led to disaster anyway. And here we are shown clearly that the Carolingian system was not something pre-existing or authored, but something that emerged from the ensemble of actions of numerous players. So to me, this chapter is an object lesson in how you can write history that explains the mutual interactivity of individual agency and the structures within which people act. The other thing it does is it puts the reader very firmly into the shoes of the protagonists, showing us how their anxieties and their uncertainties shaped their actions, not just the outcomes that we know, but they didn't. And this has the welcome effect of putting some drama back into the story as well. A case in point is Stuart's account of Louis the Pious's nervous journey to Aachen upon hearing of his own father's death in the year 814. A journey that is not usually much more than a footnote or a short discussion in most accounts of the period, but is here shown to be absolutely loaded with meaning. One of the reasons that this works so well is that Stuart's focus on the royal family brings figures into the story who are normally marginalized in the historiography. The likes of Bernard of Italy, Pippin the Hunchback, family members. These are family members who wanted to be kings and failed and were therefore dismissed by contemporaries as rebels. And here in this book, they are rescued from that damnatio memoriae and shown to be real players in the story. Now, the best example of this is perhaps Pippin II of Aquitaine, a grandson of Louis the Pious, who's usually referred to parenthetically as one of the 9th century's most persistent rebels, taking the lead here from contemporary sources, which denounced him as unfit to rule due to his interest in drinking and partying. But as Stuart underlines, Pippin saw himself as a king, and so did plenty of other people at the time. He wasn't just a pain in the neck for King Charles the Bald, he was an integral part of the Carolingian dynasty. He might have failed in the end, but he spent 30 years failing. And he arguably did as much as anyone to shape Frankish politics in the 840s and 850s. What Stuart shows brilliantly in his account of Pippin II is that Pippin was playing exactly the same game as all the proper Carolingians were, the ones who succeeded, just with a different set of cards. A roll of the dice different, and the reign of Pippin II, rather than the reign of Charles the Bald, could have been the origin story of French history. So this is one of the where getting away from this sort of seductive narrative of rise, of framework of rise and fall is beneficial, because that framework is what makes us take our eyes off people like Pippin II, who are put back in the story here. So all of this adds up to a new perspective, a completely new perspective on many older questions. Stuart says the Carolingian dynasty was simultaneously glorious and vulnerable. And most of us are interested in the glory. Stuart is more interested in the vulnerability. And I think this as well is something that really stands out as a distinctive thesis in this book. I mean, I completely buy it, but I do wonder sometimes how anxious these guys really needed to be. As Stuart points out, there was no residual Merovingian challenge on the death of Pippin III in 768. In the year 885, the West Franks still invited Charles the Fat to be their king, despite alternative options. These seem to me to be the two moments, 768, 885, when the system as a whole was most obviously vulnerable, but the dog did not bark either time. The book is so convincing about the difficulty of cancelling members of the family like Pippin II of Aquitaine, who were born in their own minds to be king, that I did wonder why, in some cases, for example, Pippin the Hunchback, it was apparently so easy, and why, and also more, beyond that, why the Carolingians were so much more successful in policing their family than others had been. Why did nobody of the many who saw themselves as Carolingian adjacent manage to bluff their way into the system in the way that happened quite often to, for example, Ian Wood's Merovingians? So those are just some questions. I imagine it's case by case, and luck and circumstance must have played a part. Reproductive luck is a big part of what makes the Capetian dynasty such a long-lasting dynasty in later centuries. I also wondered, though, what role wealth might have played in this, and whether the sheer spending capacity of the Carolingians might have been something that helped seal the deal, as discussed by Stuart in chapter 2, where significant centres like Prüm were brought into the Carolingian orbit through ostentatious generosity. And I'm also thinking here of a charter of Lothair II, where he complains that he doesn't have enough resources, but he says the reason he needs them is so that he can give them away to people. Anyway, these are just some passing thoughts. I want to finish by marveling again at how this book manages to not only be a highly original and important work of scholarship, but also a great read, bringing the Carolingians back to life with a sharp eye for a telling anecdote and a new perspective. Stuart says in the preface that the book is unashamedly elite, but I hope that that is a joke. It's actually written with fantastic generosity. The level of scholarship is stunning. The command of the sources and the range of reference, incredible. But the learning is never flaunted and the historiography is never laboured. Personally, I've never been disagreed with so agreeably. And I think this tells us something also about the author. So I'll finish by saying thank you, Stuart, and many congratulations on this book.
Hi, so once again, missing people online. What will happen now is that Stuart himself will speak, and then we will have some questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Simon. That's characteristically generous, but uncharacteristically not very sharp. I think you could have pushed some things more. Back in Sweden in the 1950s, there was a meeting to honor the theatre and film director Ingmar Bergman, who used to be a big noise in culture. And people turned up and honored him, but there was a piece submitted by a French critic, Ernst Riff, which took Mr. Bergman to pieces, pointing out the shallowness of his ideas, the utter dependence of his performances on other people, the actors, the cameramen, the makeup people, the clunkiness of the language he put into the mouths of his actors. And it really is a stinging critique. And it was written by Ingmar Bergman. Ernst Rief was a pseudonym. And I'm of course not going to do something like that, but the author knows where the bodies are buried, and the author knows what's not been successful in the book, which is why it's so affecting and gratifying to hear Simon's remarks. Thank you, and not for the first time. The book is perhaps too much about failure and anxiety. Those of you who know me will know I'm a nervous little man with a lot to be nervous about. And perhaps there has been some projection of a sense of 30 years of failing into these ruthless and wealthy warlords and their vampire queens, according to Johannes Fried. So perhaps there has been too much anxiety. But I stand by that dialectically, the system that is most confident is in some ways the system that is most anxious. Why does it have to be so confident? Why is there so much effort to keep the show on the road? And that is the main argument of the book, that performance is everything. I'm so glad that Simon picked up the musical references. Ginta Nelson argued fiercely that Rodgers and Hammerstein had no place in the book, but she didn't suggest an alternative melody, so I kept it. I kept it in, and they're more fun than Bourdieu and make the same point. So I would stand by the arguments. The problems are, as Simon says, that some of the cases of failure and of dogs that don't bark are difficult perhaps to incorporate in the model, and that's the whole point of dogs that don't bark. That's the key thing about them and why they are good to think with. I think the answer does come down to wealth, that the winners tended to turn out to have more resources, more to offer, a better line of credit with the aristocracy and their followers, and the losers didn't get to the tipping point where they could become more credible. They had Carolingianness, but they didn't always manage to realize it. And that's just a fancy way of saying that luck and happenstance are key factors, and we have to work them into our analysis, and it's difficult to work contingency into a book that is as long as this and spends so much time repeating the same points about structure. So I would tend to agree on the whole with Simon's other remarks about the perceptiveness and argument about the book, but I don't think all reviewers will be as kind. There's a danger in the book of a circular argument. If you identify certain key factors as crucial in making success and hallmarks of a dynasty, and then you go and look for them, you'll tend to find them. And then they feed into the explanatory power, you hope, of your argument. So there's a problem there. I tried very hard in the book to remember that it's a book about communication in a pre-modern era. So the amount of time it takes to get a message across a landscape is something I tried to factor into the analysis, remembering Peter Brown's brilliant remark about the pre-modern world. It's much bigger than our world because messages take longer to cross it. And it got bigger again in winter. And the harbours froze up, the roads turned to mud, and it becomes even more difficult to communicate and to maintain structures in this pre-modern era. As I've tried to remember that, but I don't think I've remembered it all the time. I've not said enough about this being a manuscript culture. So trying to recreate a discourse that I believe did have hegemonic sway and hegemonic power. It was the music that people danced to, although in a kind of stately Gelderland style kind of way. Those of you who know A Knight's Tale might think of that. But it could have been a very different book if it had been written by different scholars. And so I hope they do take this and test it. But again, I tried to remember that. And I talk about the importance of trying to remember things because this is quite a long book. It covers a long period of time. I'd read quite a lot of things. There's a lot of other people's ideas in it. And it's taken a very long time to write the book. And it'd be nice to say that it evolved and got better over that time, but I don't think it did. It was good from the start and it was good at the end. That's what happens. There you go. It is a book that is the product of help from a lot of people, some of whom are here tonight, which is fantastic, family, friends, colleagues. A lot of it is due to top European intellectuals in Utrecht, Vienna, and other parts of the continent, whose ideas I've shamelessly plundered and Englished in my inimitable style so they can't recognize them. So sue me. I'm immensely grateful to them. It is a British book, though. It does, I hope, take a place in that British contribution to the history of the Frankish Empire that Simon mentioned. It's a product of my years in Oxford. It is above all a Glasgow book. Charlemagne there are Glasgow connections with Charlemagne. I mean, Charlemagne probably didn't even know about the existence of Govan. It seems hard to believe, but he probably didn't. But he knew about the Scots, although he knew they were Irish. But his ancestor, St. Arnulf, the great saint of Metz, has a story involving a wronged queen, a missing ring, and a fish served at dinner with the ring inside it. It is, of course, the story of St. Mungo, St. Kentigern, that is part of that general repertoire of folklore motifs that we find in Glasgow and we find in Francia in the 7th and 8th centuries. And this is the only story we're told that has survived from Charlemagne's own mouth, Charlemagne's own lips. So it's a story about a fish and a ring, and it rhymes with Glasgow. We have a Carolingian manuscript in our wonderful university library, 1200 years old, fascinating medical manuscript in very good nick, a real research project waiting there. And for somebody in Glasgow trying to write a book like this, there couldn't have been a better environment. Well, there could have been. I mean, the University of Glasgow is a capricious mistress in many ways, but in other ways absolutely predictable. But the university is a house with many mansions, and the subject of history and the School of Humanities has been an extraordinarily privileged place to work in. I have been helped. There are people here who know exactly, very specifically, what help they've given. There are others who may not be aware. Finishing the book in a rush under COVID conditions, I didn't write all my thanks to everybody in the preface. It would have been a separate volume of thanks. But my friends and colleagues among the teachers of history here and the students, some of whom are here tonight, and above all the postgraduate community in Glasgow, have been indispensable in the making of the book. So it's your fault, and above all in their faith that the book would actually get written. A faith shared by some other academics, some of whom seem to be listening in. A faith shared, coupled with questioning by my family, who are here tonight, whose faith that it would happen and whose hope that it was all worth it was easily matched by their increasing skepticism as to its progress. A lot of paper filled the study, but who could make sense of the squiggles? But eventually it came out. There are ways of writing big books, and Walter Benjamin back in the 1920s said, oh, there's ways of writing big fat books. He said, 1, the whole composition must be permeated with a protracted and wordy exposition of the initial plan. So tell people at the beginning and then keep doing it. 2, terms are to be included for conceptions that, except in their initial appearance, appear nowhere in the whole book. Excellent. Numerous opponents who all share the same argument should each be refuted individually. And the initial draft of the book, which would have been this size, very much did that. And that another problem in the book perhaps is that its initial conception was very much following tracks in German scholarship, German language scholarship, which is magnificent scholarship, but does have going to say tank tracks, that's a very unfortunate analogy, does tend to reify conceptual terms and often fossilize historiographical debates. And I joined that very happily, finding a niche there where my insecurities could find real play by measuring up to the Germans. And I've tried again to change that. And that's where Vienna, Utrecht, and Britain and colleagues in the States have been immensely, immensely helpful. I would end then, I think, just by urging you to believe Simon when he says it's well worth snapping up in paperback, but admitting that what really haunts me looking at it now, as I try to turn my mind to other things, is a poem by Jacques Prévert, where he just simply lists all the French kings called Louis. Louis I, Louis II, Louis III, Louis IV, Louis V. It goes all the way up to Louis XVIII. He says, what are you going to do with this bunch of chancellors who couldn't be bothered to count up to 20? And I think he's maybe right, that again, I may have been too much under the spell of a dynasty whose spell I was trying to analyze and disenchant. But I stand by what I've written. I think it works as an argument. If it does, it is thanks to people here, people online, and people not here, but I am grateful to you all. I'm particularly grateful to Simon, who suggested that it did work. So thank you very much. Thank you.
So, well, thank you enormously to our speakers.